Baruch Spinoza lived in a time when thinking freely was not just an act of courage but a real danger. Born in 1632 in Amsterdam within a Sephardic Jewish community, he quickly demonstrated an intelligence that set him apart, but his inclination toward philosophy and doubt made him a problem for those who believed in the absolute authority of tradition. At the age of 23, he was excommunicated from his community with a condemnation so severe that even his family was forbidden to speak to him. His only crime was thinking too much, questioning the existence of a personal God, denying the immortality of the soul, and asserting that religion was, in large part, a human construction designed to impose obedience. Remember to subscribe to the channel, activate the bell, and give us your opinion. Far from yielding, Spinoza embraced his new life in intellectual exile with remarkable serenity. He sought refuge in no other faith, nor did he try to regain his social status. Instead, he chose to live humbly, working as a lens grinder, while writing works that would change the course of philosophy. His Ethics, published posthumously, proposed a vision of the world where God was not a separate being from the universe but the totality of nature itself. Happiness, he argued, was not found in wealth or fame but in understanding, the ability to see the world with clarity and accept its inevitability without fear or despair. Those who knew him described him as a calm, almost unshakable man whose philosophy was not just theory but a way of life. He believed that the key to freedom lay in understanding human nature and accepting that many of the things that torment us are products of ignorance or uncontrolled passion. If there is anyone who can offer practical advice on how to live without fear, hatred, or anguish, it is him. His ideas do not promise easy comfort, but they do offer a way to exist with dignity and inner peace. Spinoza's first piece of advice is simple but transformative: stop fighting against the inevitable. Most human suffering comes from our resistance to reality, from our inability to accept that the world is not designed to fulfill our desires. We want things to be different, for life to follow our terms, but nature does not operate according to our wishes. There is nothing contingent in nature. All things have been determined by the necessity of the divine nature to exist and act in a certain way, he wrote. In other words, the universe follows its own laws, and our frustration comes from not understanding them or wishing they were different. Accepting reality does not mean resigning passively but learning to see it clearly. Spinoza insisted that knowledge is the key to freedom. When we understand why things happen, we stop feeling like victims of fate. If something causes us pain, instead of complaining, we should ask ourselves, is this something I can change? If the answer is no, then struggling against it will only bring unnecessary suffering. And if the answer is yes, then action replaces complaint. Spinoza did not say we should not feel emotions, but that we should not be enslaved by them. This advice is particularly difficult to apply because we cling to our expectations, the idea that the world should be fair, that love should be eternal, that people should act according to our moral standards. But nature does Not stop for our grievances. Learning to see things as they are, without distortion. Without illusions, and without expecting the universe to conform to us, is the first step toward tranquility. It does not mean we stop acting, but that we stop exhausting ourselves in futile struggles. And if we achieve this, then we begin to understand what true freedom meant for Spinoza. Spinoza's second piece of advice is that freedom does not mean doing whatever we want, but understanding why we want what we want. We like to believe that we are the masters of our decisions, that each choice we make is an act of pure will. But Spinoza dismantles this illusion with implacable logic. Men think themselves free because they are conscious of their actions but ignorant of the causes by which they are determined, he wrote. There is no free will in the way we usually imagine it. Every desire, every action, every decision we make is determined by a chain of prior causes, many of which we are unaware of. 4. Spinoza, true freedom is not the ability to choose arbitrarily, but the ability to understand why we act as we do. Only when we grasp the causes that drive us can we act with full awareness. If we are swept away by passions, fear, anger, irrational desire, we are like leaves in the wind, moved by forces we do not control. But if we understand the nature of our emotions and the reasons behind our impulses, we cease to be slaves to them. The free person is not the one who does whatever they please, but the one who acts from knowledge rather than automatic reaction. This advice clashes with our intuition. We like to think that every choice we make is truly ours, that we have absolute control over our lives. But Spinoza forces us to admit that this is often not the case. Why do we cling to certain ideas? Why do we get angry at specific words? Why do we chase things that, once obtained, fail to bring us the happiness we expected? Freedom, for him, begins when we stop acting on impulse and start observing ourselves clearly. It is not about eliminating emotions but understanding them so they do not rule over us, because the one who does not know themselves is not free. They are merely a prisoner of their own desires. Spinoza's third piece of advice is that happiness is not found in external things, but in inner clarity. We spend our lives chasing pleasures, recognition, and success, as if they were the only paths to satisfaction. But according to Spinoza, any happiness that depends on something outside of us is fragile. If our well-being is tied to fortune, the love of another person, or social prestige, then we live in fear, because we know all of these things can disappear. True happiness, he says, does not come from what we have but from how we understand our own existence. Blessedness is not the reward of virtue, but virtue itself, he wrote. With this, he rejected the idea that happiness is something we attain after fulfilling certain conditions. It is not a distant goal but a way of living in the present. It is not about accumulating things or receiving approval but about finding satisfaction in simply understanding reality as it is. Happiness is not a prize that comes after doing the right thing. Rather, doing the right thing is in itself the greatest source of happiness. This advice is difficult to accept because We are conditioned to think of happiness as something to be obtained, not something to be practiced. But Spinoza challenges us to see it differently. Instead of asking what we lack in order to be happy, we should ask why we believe happiness lies in something we do not yet have. Joy, according to him, does not come from what we possess but from the clarity with which we understand our own existence. And the one who grasps this truth stops living in anticipation of something external to complete them. They no longer seek happiness in the future because they find it in the present. Spinoza's fourth piece of advice is that love based on dependency is not love, it is slavery. Most people seek love as a source of security, identity, and meaning. But for Spinoza, love should not be a chain that binds us to another. Rather, it should be an expression of our own free nature. He who imagines himself to be loved by someone whom he hates will be afflicted with sadness mixed with hatred toward that person, he wrote. In other words, when love depends on expectations, the need to be reciprocated, or the desire for validation, it ceases to be a source of joy and becomes a source of suffering. This does not mean that Spinoza rejected love, but rather that he saw it as a force that must arise from understanding, not possession. To love is not to seek in another what we lack, but to share with them what we already are. If our love is based on the fear of loss, jealousy, or the anxiety of not being enough, then it is not true love, it is disguised dependency. True connection with another human being does not stem from need but from freedom. Only those who love from a place of wholeness, not from lack, can truly love. This advice is difficult to accept because it contradicts the romantic idea that love should complete us. But for Spinoza, no one can complete another. If we seek our happiness in another person, we will inevitably find suffering, because no relationship can fill the emptiness of someone who has not learned to be at peace with themselves. The strongest love is not the one born from the fear of solitude, but the one given without demands, without the obsession to possess, and without the anguish of losing. To love is to understand, and to understand is to accept that the other person does not belong to us. Spinoza's fifth piece of advice is that fear is the root of slavery, both mental and emotional. We live under the rule of worries, of fears that paralyze us and make us act against our own reason. We fear the future, the opinions of others, pain, and death. But Spinoza warns us that all fear arises from ignorance. Fear cannot exist without hope, nor hope without fear, he wrote. In other words, as long as we keep hoping the world will conform to our desires, fear will continue to rule. The power that fear holds over us comes from making us believe that we have no control over our existence. It drives us to seek saviors, guides, and external authorities to tell us what to do and what to think. This is why Spinoza saw fear as the most effective tool for manipulation. Those who control people's fears control their will. Governments, religions, and power structures have long used fear to keep people in submission, to make them believe they need protection from threats they often do not even understand. But once a person comprehends the nature of fear, they cease to be its slave. This does not mean living recklessly or ignoring real dangers, but rather refusing to be ruled by what we cannot control. Fear makes us see problems where there are none, forcing us into constant anxiety over things that may never happen. For Spinoza, the only way to overcome fear is through knowledge. The more we understand the world, the less power our fears have over us. And when fear loses its grip, freedom stops being a distant ideal and becomes a way of life. Spinoza's sixth piece of advice is that rational thought is the only path to true freedom. Most people believe they are free because they can choose between different options. But for Spinoza, this is an illusion. A person is not free if they act on impulse, if they are driven by emotions, or if they conform to the expectations of others. True freedom is not doing whatever we want in a given moment, it is understanding why we want what we want and making decisions with clarity. A man is free insofar as he lives according to reason, he wrote. This does not mean that reason should suppress emotions, but rather that emotions should not govern us without our understanding. The problem is that many confuse freedom with the immediate satisfaction of their desires. But Spinoza warns that the truly free person is not the one who follows every impulse, but the one who understands the nature of their own thoughts. Anger, envy, greed, uncontrolled attachment, all these emotions trap us. Not because they are inherently evil, but because they cloud our judgment and make us slaves to automatic reactions. Reason is not cold or devoid of humanity, as some believe, but the tool that allows us to act in ways that are truly beneficial for us. This advice does not mean we must be purely rational at all times, but it does mean that reason should be our guide. Spinoza shows us that the more we understand the world and our own nature, the less we rely on illusions and false expectations. Freedom is not living without rules, it is living with understanding. And the person who has reached this state is no longer a prisoner of their environment, because they have found within themselves the source of their own power. Spinoza's final piece of advice is that inner peace is found in harmony with nature. Not in the sense of retreating into the wilderness or disconnecting from the world, but in accepting that we are part of a greater whole that we cannot control. The free man thinks least of all of death, and his wisdom is a meditation not on death, but on life, he wrote. There is no point in living in fear of fate, loss, or change. Nature follows its course with or without our approval. And the sooner we understand this, the sooner we can live without anxiety. This perspective is radically different from other philosophies that seek happiness in unattainable ideals or in promises of another life. For Spinoza, the meaning of existence is not in what we hope for, but in what already is. Joy is not a future goal, but a state that arises when we stop struggling against the inevitable. It is not the absence of problems that brings tranquility, but the understanding that suffering comes from our resistance to accepting reality. Once we grasp this, we no longer see life as a battlefield, but as an expression of nature that simply is. Spinoza does not offer an easy path or Promises of immediate comfort. His teachings demand a profound shift in how we see the world. But those who understand them discover something that few ever achieve. A freedom that depends on nothing external. A happiness that does not break under changing circumstances. A life in which one no longer seeks to escape the present, but to fully inhabit it with clarity. And perhaps, in the end, that is the only real way to overcome fear, doubt, and suffering.